March 1945. The Rhine shimmered under a cold, pale moon. Through the fog, a German reconnaissance patrol crept forward, engines low, breath held, eyes scanning the dark tree line. Ahead of them, across a muddy field, the silhouettes of hundreds of American tanks loomed beneath the pines. The forest seemed alive with machinery engines growling, metal glinting, faint radio chatter cutting through the wind. The Germans halted. Through binoculars, they saw what they feared: an entire armored division, massing silently on their flank. Orders went out in haste. Artillery coordinates relayed. Panzer reinforcements shifted south. Then, as the first shells landed, the illusion shattered. The tanks did not burn, they folded. Canvas skin deflated under the shockwave, crumpling into the mud like fallen tents. It wasn't an army. It was art. A deception so bold it swallowed entire divisions whole. That night, under a forest of decoys, German armor vanished not by force, but by imagination. And behind that illusion stood a secret American unit the world would not learn about for decades. By the spring of 1944, Europe was a continent on fire. The Allies had clawed their way back from the beaches of North Africa to the fields of Italy, and now, with D-Day on the horizon, the invasion of Fortress Europe loomed. The Wehrmacht still held 1,000 miles of front, but its grasp was tightening, its strength bleeding away across every border. The coming Allied landings would determine not only the outcome of the war, but the shape of the post-war world. For the Western Allies, deception had become a weapon as vital as any gun. The Germans had built their empire on speed and precision armies that struck fast, reacting to even the smallest clue. If the Allies could feed them false clues, if they could make the Germans believe in ghosts, entire armies could move unseen. This idea became doctrine. In 1943, British intelligence perfected the art with Operation Mincemeat, using a corpse carrying fake plans to mislead the Axis into defending Greece instead of Sicily. The ruse worked. Deception had proved its power. When the Allies turned their eyes toward Normandy, that lesson deepened. In the months before D-Day, Allied planners constructed the greatest illusion of the war, Operation Fortitude, a phantom army led by the legendary General George S. Patton. Inflatable tanks, fake radio signals, and double agents convinced Hitler that the invasion would strike at Pas de Calais. The deception held. On June 6, 1944, when real troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, much of the German 15th Army sat idle, waiting for an attack that would never come. But deception could not stop there. After the landings, Allied armies broke out from the beaches and began their drive across France. The speed of advance was breathtaking, yet so was the chaos. The enemy fought back with armored counterblows that struck wherever the Allies seemed weakest. Commanders needed a way to control that perception, to appear strong where they were weak, to vanish where they were massing. That responsibility fell to a new experimental force, one unlike anything else in military history. In January 1944, under orders from the U.S. Army's Chief of Engineers, a unit was quietly assembled at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Its official designation, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Its unofficial title, whispered later in memoirs and declassified reports, was the Ghost Army. It was a force of 100 men, but on the battlefield it could impersonate 30,000. Instead of heavy weapons, they carried air pumps. Instead of armor plates, they used rubber and paint. Their mission: to deceive, distract, and mislead the enemy through a fusion of art, engineering, and psychology. They were not ordinary soldiers. Among them were painters, sculptors, architects, set designers, and sound engineers, graduates from the nation's finest art schools. They had studied perspective, shadow, and illusion, and now they would weaponize those skills. In a war of steel and blood, they were the artists of deception. After months of secret training, the unit was shipped to England, then to France in the summer of 1944, following the invasion. Their first tests were small, misleading German artillery, by simulating fake bridgeheads or convoy routes. Each success emboldened them. As Allied armies advanced toward the German border, their operations grew bolder still. Inflatable tanks filled the fields. Loudspeakers broadcast the rumble of imaginary convoys. Radio teams mimicked the chatter of entire divisions. And as the front line stretched east toward the Rhine, the Ghost Army prepared for what would become one of its greatest feats: a deception so convincing that entire German armored formations would move against shadows. It was here, in the forests near the Rhine in March 1945, that the legend of the night the tanks vanished would take form. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its crescendo. The German army, though battered and retreating, still fought with the discipline of desperation. Every river line, every hill became a fortress. The Allies, now stretched from the North Sea to the Alps, faced not only an enemy that refused to die, but a landscape that punished every mistake. The Rhine, wide and cold, was the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. To cross it meant ending the war. To fail meant bleeding for months more. For the American High Command, deception once again became a strategy. If the Germans could be convinced that the main assault would fall in one place while the real attack struck elsewhere, it might save tens of thousands of lives. That responsibility fell to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. The 23rd was unlike any other formation on the continent. It was a collection of 4 specialized units, each designed to simulate a different dimension of warfare. First came the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the artists and builders. They designed and constructed entire phantom divisions out of rubber and canvas. Tanks, jeeps, artillery, all inflatable, lightweight, and easily moved under cover of night. To a reconnaissance plane or a distant scout, they looked real. Painted shadows and glinting metal paint added to the illusion, fooling even trained observers. Then there was the 3102nd Signal Service Company, Special, the masters of sound. Using massive amplifiers and pre-recorded effects captured from real units, they could project the roar of engines, tank treads, and bridge-building sounds over several miles. Villagers swore they heard convoys rumbling through the night that never existed. German patrols chased phantom divisions that had only existed in the air. Supporting them was the Signal Company, Special, responsible for radio deception. Operators memorized the unique fingerprints of real U.S. divisions' communication styles and mimicked them perfectly. Their transmissions filled the airwaves with chatter that convinced German intercept units that the entire corps were relocating. Lastly, the 406th Engineer Combat Company, Special, handled logistics and security, setting up decoy camps, laying fake tracks in the mud, even planting fake laundry lines to suggest the presence of thousands of soldiers. Together, these 4 units could conjure an entire army overnight. Their deceptions were not random tricks. Each was carefully coordinated with higher commands. They worked under the direction of the 12th Army Group and Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Every illusion had a purpose: to mislead enemy reconnaissance, mask a real unit's movement, or divert a German counterattack. And it worked. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, the Ghost Army executed over 20 full-scale deceptions across France, Luxembourg, and Germany. At Metz, their phantom artillery forced the Germans to divert guns away from the real front. Near the Moselle, a false bridgehead drew Luftwaffe raids away from actual crossings. In Luxembourg, they impersonated the 4th Armored Division just days before that division broke through to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Each success gave them confidence. Each operation blurred the line between illusion and war. But the stakes rose sharply as the Allies approached the Rhine. The German High Command was desperate to prevent crossings. Entire panzer divisions were repositioned along likely points of attack. To cross successfully, the Americans needed to appear everywhere at once and nowhere real. In March 1945, the Ghost Army was ordered to conduct its most daring operation yet. Codenamed Operation Viersen, it was designed to convince the Germans that 2 U.S. divisions were massing north of the Rhine, preparing to cross while the real crossing would happen miles away, at Remagen and Wesel. For 4 nights, the Ghost Army would create an entire phantom battlefield. They would set up fake tanks under tree cover, broadcast convoy sounds across the river, and light false camps visible to German spotters. It was a masterstroke of deception, executed under the threat of discovery and artillery fire. The stage was set. Under a canopy of forest near the Rhine, a false army was about to come to life. And before dawn, German armor would vanish into the mirage. War is often told in steel and blood, in men who fight and machines that kill. But in the Ghost Army, the weapons were brushes, compressors, and reels of sound tape. Their bullets were ideas. The human angle artists at war, many of the men who formed the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, had never imagined themselves in uniform. They came from art schools and advertising studios, from architecture firms and design agencies. Before the war, they painted portraits, drafted buildings, and sculpted bronze. Now they were asked to craft illusions powerful enough to deceive one of the most disciplined militaries on Earth. Among them was Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion designer. There was Ellsworth Kelly, whose minimalist canvases would one day hang in galleries around the world. And there were hundreds more illustrators from Harper's Bazaar, set designers from Hollywood, and sound technicians from radio stations across America. They shared one purpose: to protect lives through deception. Every fake tank inflated meant fewer real soldiers on the line. Each false radio signal meant an enemy shell falling harmlessly on empty fields. Life inside the unit was strange and secretive. They were soldiers, but not like any others. They built their tanks from canvas, not steel. Their nights were spent pumping air into rubber vehicles and painting shadows on the ground to fool aerial scouts. Even in the midst of war, there was humor. The absurd sight of a man tightening a wrench on an inflatable Sherman, or sketching camouflage patterns by lamplight as artillery thundered miles away. But beneath the humor was a deadly purpose. If they were discovered, the Germans would not spare them. They carried few real weapons and operated close to the front, sometimes just a few hundred yards behind the lines. Their safety depended on the strength of their illusion. To the outside world, their missions were invisible. No public glory, no headlines. Just silent success, the kind that saved men they would never meet. And that anonymity suited them. They knew that victory sometimes depended not on who fired the loudest gun, but on who could make the enemy believe a lie. The technological angle. The art of the invisible behind every illusion stood science. The Ghost Army operated at the intersection of engineering and imagination. Their inflatable armor was built using advanced rubberized fabric technology developed by the U.S. Rubber Company, the same manufacturers that made life rafts and aircraft seals. Each decoy tank could be carried by a few men, inflated in minutes and arranged in formations that looked authentic from above. To make the deception perfect, they studied every detail. Tracks were carved into the mud by dragging tank treads behind jeeps. Dummy tire ruts led to fake repair depots. Canvas tents were set up in precise military alignment, complete with fake washing lines, empty fuel drums, and wooden crates stamped with unit codes. Even the smoke from their campfires was planned not too much, not too little enough to suggest life without drawing suspicion. Then came the sound. The 3102nd Sonic Company developed what they called the Ghost Symphony, a library of sound effects recorded from real armored divisions. Using 24-channel wire recorders and massive amplifiers mounted on half-tracks, they could simulate convoys moving, tanks starting, or pontoon bridges being built. The sound was projected up to 15 miles away, a perfect lure for German reconnaissance patrols listening through the fog. But deception was not just about what the enemy heard or saw, it was about what they believed. To reinforce the illusion, fake radio operators mimicked the habits of real U.S. divisions' call signs, slang, and message frequency. They created an entire phantom world on the airwaves, complete with false orders, troop reports, and coded signals. German intercept teams, convinced they were tracking the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, noted their presence near the Rhine exactly as planned. Together, these systems created the illusion of overwhelming strength where there was none, an army of shadows made of rubber and sound, but powerful enough to move real tanks and men in the opposite direction. As the Ghost Army perfected its art, the battlefield became a stage one where every illusion had consequences measured in lives, and the curtain was about to rise on their most dangerous performance yet. The tactical angle shadows that shaped the battlefield. Every deception was a chess move played on a board of mud and fire. For the Ghost Army, the challenge was to manipulate the enemy's expectations without ever being seen as actors in the play. Each operation demanded meticulous planning, terrain analysis, enemy observation habits, and the rhythm of Allied maneuvers all had to be studied. Their deployments usually followed a pattern. First came intelligence aerial photographs, reconnaissance reports, and intercepted communications. Analysts determined where German eyes were watching. Then the artists and engineers moved in. Overnight, an empty meadow could become a bustling tank assembly area. In a single day, they could move in 1,000 men who didn't exist. They even had a term for it: tactical painting. The battlefield was their canvas, and they painted strength wherever it was needed most. For Operation Viersen in March 1945, this meant creating the illusion that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine near Neuss, while the real divisions were secretly repositioning further south. The Ghost Army simulated not just armor and vehicles, but the entire logistical footprint of a corps: motor pools, command tents, supply depots, even field hospitals. German spotters soon noticed the buildup. Their aerial photos confirmed lines of tanks in the woods and activity along the river banks. Radio intercepts supported the same story. The deception had become reality in enemy intelligence files. Then the sound crews moved in. Through fog and over water, the night came alive with the drone of convoys and the clang of pontoon bridges. It was an irresistible target, a perfect opportunity for the Germans to commit their armor northward. And that was precisely what the Allies needed. While the enemy redirected precious resources to counter a phantom threat, real American divisions crossed the Rhine elsewhere with minimal resistance. For the price of air and imagination, the Ghost Army had shifted the balance of an entire front. But deception was fragile. One misplaced light, one soldier speaking out of turn, could collapse the illusion. Every man in the Ghost Army understood this. They rehearsed silence as much as spectacle. Their true power lay not in what they built, but in how perfectly they belonged to the illusion. The psychological angle. The war inside the mind war is as much mental as it is physical. When soldiers can no longer trust what they see or hear, their discipline begins to fracture. That was the invisible front where the Ghost Army fought best. The Germans, proud of their tactical acumen, prided themselves on reading the battlefield. But as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, reports began to contradict reality. A division spotted one day would vanish the next. A line of tanks would appear on the horizon, only to disappear by dawn. Field officers sent scouts into forests that turned out to be empty. In their diaries, some German soldiers called it the American trickery. To the Wehrmacht's intelligence branches, it was a nightmare. They could no longer trust the evidence before their eyes. Every photograph, every intercepted message could be a lie. This psychological fog worked both ways. While the Germans doubted themselves, the Allies began to believe in the power of deception. The Ghost Army's illusions didn't just save lives. They inspired commanders to think creatively, to understand that victory wasn't always about firepower, but about shaping the enemy's mind. Within the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this duality of art and war, of reality and imagination, became a philosophy. Their unofficial motto, whispered among the men, was simple: "We are confused, therefore we win." Even years later, survivors recalled the haunting beauty of their missions. Inflatable tanks under moonlight, fake convoys vanishing at dawn, the eerie satisfaction of watching distant explosions fall harmlessly on empty ground, knowing real soldiers were safe because of their illusion. By the time of Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army had mastered not just the science of deception, but the psychology of belief. They knew exactly how far to push just enough realism to convince, just enough mystery to terrify. Now, as the spring of 1945 arrived, the Allies stood at the edge of Germany itself. The Rhine shimmered before them, wide and defiant. And under that calm surface, the Ghost Army prepared for its grandest illusion, a performance that would make an entire enemy division disappear into a forest of shadows. March 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final act, but no one on the front lines knew it yet. The Rhine River, swollen with snowmelt, cut through western Germany like a final line of defense. On its eastern banks, remnants of German panzer divisions waited in ambush. On the western side, thousands of American troops prepared to cross, but not all of them were real. Just north of Neuss, in the shadow of a pine forest, trucks rolled in under cover of darkness. Their headlights were blacked out, their engines muffled by canvas. When they stopped, men jumped out not with rifles but with air hoses. The 603rd Camouflage engineers went to work. Within hours, the empty fields began to fill with life. Rubber tanks, Shermans, half-tracks, jeeps rose from the mud like ghosts. Each one inflated into full size in minutes, held steady by ropes and weighted frames. Some were even painted with unit markings copied from real divisions stationed miles away. To a pilot flying overhead at dawn, it would look like the entire 30th Infantry Division was massing along the river. Nearby, the 3102nd Sonic Company set up their amplifiers behind earthen berms. Massive speakers, each the size of a truck tire, were angled toward the east bank. Sound crews loaded wire recordings captured from real tank divisions, convoys idling, tracks grinding on gravel, the metallic rhythm of bridge construction. At precisely 2200 hours, the symphony began. Across the water, German sentries heard it first. The low rumble of engines, then the clatter of vehicles moving, men shouting orders, the unmistakable echo of pontoon sections being dragged toward the river. In the dark, imagination filled the gaps. To them, it could only mean one thing. The Americans were preparing to cross the Rhine here tonight. Panzergruppe West received the report at 23:15. Scouts confirmed movement in the forest. Artillery observers saw flickering lights, vehicle shadows, and tents glowing faintly behind the trees. By midnight, German headquarters near Krefeld had issued new orders. Divert armored reinforcements north. Every tank they moved was one less to defend the real crossings further south. In the woods, the Ghost Army worked feverishly to keep the illusion alive. Generators hummed. Radio operators tapped out false transmissions imitating the 30th Division's unique call signs. Engineers dragged rubber treads behind jeeps to mark fake tracks in the mud. A few soldiers even erected wooden silhouettes of artillery guns along the tree line, complete with flash simulators that mimicked muzzle fire. And all the while, they listened to the distant growl of German artillery adjusting its aim. Shortly before dawn, the first shells fell. A deafening whistle, then thunder. The ground erupted in fountains of dirt and flame, but no one was killed. The rounds landed among decoys and empty tents. A 40-foot inflatable Sherman flipped end over end, landing in a ditch. A row of rubber half-tracks shredded into ribbons. Yet the illusion held. Through smoke and chaos, the Germans believed they were shelling real targets. Behind the fake front, the real U.S. divisions, the 79th Infantry and elements of the 30th Corps, were crossing the Rhine elsewhere, under far lighter fire. The deception had worked perfectly. Every shell wasted on the decoys bought safety for the men at the true crossing sites. By sunrise, the forest smelled of burning canvas and ozone. The sound crews powered down their amplifiers. Radio chatter faded to silence. One by one, the inflatable tanks deflated, sinking into the mud like fading dreams. To anyone arriving late, German scouts, Luftwaffe pilots, or even Allied units, the battlefield seemed haunted. 1,000 tanks had stood here hours ago, and now there was nothing. The illusion had consumed itself, its purpose complete, and while the Germans scrambled to reorient their forces, the real Allied spearheads were already across the Rhine, advancing into the heart of Germany. When dawn came on March 25, 1945, the fog clung to the Rhine like a curtain drawn between two worlds. To the German commanders watching from the eastern shore, the night's noise had been unmistakable. Engines, bridge building, shouting all signs of a river crossing. Reports from outposts confirmed flashes, shadows, and the silhouettes of tanks under the trees. They were convinced that the Americans had chosen this sector to force the river. Orders rippled outward from the staff posts near Krefeld and Düsseldorf. 2 panzer battalions were moved north from reserve positions. Anti-tank units were redeployed. Artillery batteries recalibrated their fire plans. It was a frantic dance of reaction, a military reflex responding to an illusion. But by the time the first light revealed the truth, it was too late. German reconnaissance planes flew over the supposed bridgehead expecting to see devastation, burning vehicles, and bodies. Instead, they saw an empty forest. No movement, no armor, only torn canvas and scattered frames. The tanks that had seemed so real hours earlier now lay collapsed pale rubber shells twisted in the mud. Like the carcasses of some strange creature, the pilots reported back in disbelief. No enemy crossing at Neuss, no vehicles present. The area is deserted. Confusion spread through command channels. Where had the Americans gone? Interceptions from Allied radio still suggested the presence of 2 divisions nearby, but the battlefield was empty. German officers argued over conflicting intelligence. One side swearing the Americans had crossed, another insisting it was impossible. The truth that there had never been an army there at all was too absurd to imagine. By the time the picture cleared, the real blow had already landed. 60 miles south near Remagen and Wesel, genuine U.S. divisions were pouring across the Rhine in force. The German defenses, weakened by their redeployment toward the Decoy sector, were shattered. The Allies gained a bridgehead on the eastern bank, a decisive foothold that would accelerate the end of the war in Europe. The deception at Neuss had achieved more than tactical success. It had sown paralysis. In those critical hours, the German command system, already strained by fuel shortages, collapsing logistics, and air attacks, spent its strength fighting a ghost. Field reports later showed that entire artillery regiments had fired hundreds of rounds into empty woods. Panzer units had burned precious fuel maneuvering against a phantom threat. What they didn't realize was that the forest of tanks they had targeted was made of air. Back on the western bank, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops dismantled their operation in silence. One engineer recalled years later how surreal it felt to pack away a battlefield that had never existed. Inflatable tanks were deflated, folded, and loaded into trucks. The fake radio chatter ceased. The sound trucks switched off their amplifiers, leaving behind only the natural sounds of the river and the wind. No headlines would mention their victory. No medals would be awarded for misleading an army. Their success was measured only by the absence of death by the soldiers who crossed safely somewhere else, because an illusion had drawn fire away from them. As night fell again, the men rested beside their trucks. Some sketched the ruins of their own decoys, crumpled tanks, tire tracks, the wreckage of rubber armor. Others wrote letters home, careful never to mention what they had done. The mission was secret, and would remain so for decades. On the far bank, the war was collapsing. Hitler raged in his bunker over the failure to hold the Rhine. His generals blamed poor reconnaissance, bad luck, and the weather. No one guessed that the Allies had used artists and engineers to pull off a deception so complete it had rewritten the flow of battle. In the official reports of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, Operation Fearson was marked as a total success. Their illusions had diverted enemy attention long enough for the real crossings to succeed with minimal losses. Intelligence intercepts later confirmed that German High Command had fully believed the deception until 2 days after it ended. In military terms, it was perfect. In human terms, it was haunting to win a battle where no one fought, to create destruction where none existed, to weaponize imagination against fear. As the Ghost Army packed up its final decoys and prepared for the next assignment, they knew the war was nearly over. Yet that night on the Rhine would remain their defining masterpiece, the night they made an enemy army chase shadows through a forest that never truly existed. When the Ghost Army pulled away from Neuss, they left behind a silence that would echo for weeks in the German lines. Reconnaissance patrols that entered the forest days later found nothing of military value. No tank corps, no destroyed bridges, no American bodies, only strange remnants of tire tracks that ended in grass, faint outlines of tank treads in the mud, and torn pieces of heavy fabric that smelled faintly of rubber. To the German engineers sent to inspect, it made no sense. One report filed by a staff officer from the 15th Army noted, "The area shows clear signs of large-scale vehicular movement, but no evidence of equipment or fortifications. Possible Allied deception activity suspected." But by the time that suspicion reached higher command, the real battle had already been decided elsewhere. Across the Rhine, genuine U.S. forces under General William Simpson's 9th Army were crossing in full strength at Wesel and Remagen. The 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, shielded by the Ghost Army's illusion, seized their bridgeheads with astonishing speed. German resistance, spread thin and disoriented, collapsed within 48 hours. In those crucial days of late March 1945, the Rhine, once Hitler's last line of defense, was breached on a massive scale. Operation Fearson, though classified as a tactical deception, had strategic consequences. It didn't just save lives. It changed the tempo of the Allied advance. By April, the U.S. Army had surged across western Germany, capturing thousands of prisoners and liberating cities once thought unreachable before summer. Commanders noted how surprisingly light opposition had been in sectors where diversionary operations had taken place. Behind those statistics lay the quiet fingerprints of the Ghost Army. Their mission reports were clinical and understated. The final after-action summary for Operation Wehrmacht listed only a few bullet points. Enemy response consistent with predicted pattern. PZ units redeployed toward the decoy area. No casualties sustained by 23rd HQ spec and troops. A single concluding line read, "Objective achieved. Enemy deception is successful." But inside that sterile language hid something extraordinary, a human triumph of creativity over destruction. In an army defined by steel and firepower, the Ghost Army had fought with canvas and sound, using imagination as a weapon. Their inflatable tanks had drawn real artillery. Their fake radio traffic had tied up German intelligence. And their actors, ordinary soldiers pretending to be officers, had confused scouts and spies, deepening the illusion. General Omar Bradley later admitted that these deception units had become an indispensable tool in the Allied arsenal. "They gave us the freedom to strike where we wished," he said. "When the enemy saw a forest of tanks, he reacted, and that was all we needed." The Ghost Army's impact was measured not in bodies or destroyed cities, but in the lives spared. Every time a German gun battery shelled an empty field, a real American bridgehead survived a little longer. For the men involved, though, there was no public recognition. Their unit remained officially secret, its actions classified, its members sworn to silence. Even their families had no idea what they had done. Many went home believing their war would never be mentioned in history books. Yet within the tight-knit circles of Allied command, the operation's success spread quietly. British and Canadian officers studying deception warfare took note of the American experiment. The lessons from Wehrmacht would later influence Cold War psychological and tactical doctrines, proving that warfare had entered a new age where perception could be as lethal as bullets. The Germans, for their part, conducted their own postmortems. Captured documents after the war revealed that German intelligence units had indeed logged phantom divisions in their situation maps. In the final weeks of March 1945, their estimates of Allied strength on the Western Front were inflated by over 20% as a direct result of Allied deception signals. Those false numbers had paralyzed their ability to react decisively when the real attacks came. The Ghost Army, meanwhile, moved eastward again, assigned to one final deception near the Elbe River in April. Their work continued until Germany's surrender in May, but it was at Neuss in that forest of decoys where they reached their creative and operational peak. And as Europe collapsed around them, the men who had made tanks vanish and armies appeared out of thin air found themselves wondering whether anyone would ever know what they'd done. The truth would remain buried for decades, locked in classified archives until the silence finally began to break. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the guns fell silent, but for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the silence carried a different weight. Their war had been waged in whispers, shadows, and falsehoods. There were no victory parades for inflatable tanks, no medals for sound effects. When they returned home, they blended back into civilian life, carrying a secret they could not tell. Their unit was officially disbanded in September 1945. Every participant signed a confidentiality agreement under the Espionage Act, forbidding discussion of their operations. The record of their missions from Normandy to the Rhine was classified at the highest level. Even senior commanders who had indirectly benefited from their illusions never fully knew who they were. For decades, the Ghost Army simply vanished from history, much like the phantom armor they had built. Historians of World War II wrote about the great tank battles, the strategic bombings, and the generals who commanded them. But the artists, architects, radio men, and sound engineers who had deceived the Wehrmacht remained ghosts in the footnotes of their stories locked in government vaults. Many of them returned to creative lives. Some became painters, designers, or professors. Others entered advertising or architecture. A few, like fashion designer Bill Blass and artist Ellsworth Kelly, would later become famous in entirely different fields. None of them could publicly reveal that, before their careers began, they had helped win the war with illusion. In the post-war years, the Pentagon quietly reviewed their work. Reports concluded that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had exceeded expectations in operational deception. Their methods, simple but ingenious, were studied for their psychological effectiveness. Inflatable decoys, sonic simulations, and counterfeit radio traffic would later influence NATO training, Cold War counterintelligence, and even modern camouflage and electronic warfare. But for the men who had lived it, the secrecy felt like erasure. They had risked their lives without firing a shot operating near front lines, often under artillery range, setting up their decoys just miles from real enemy positions. A single reconnaissance plane or a misplaced transmission could have exposed them, and yet they remained invisible, unacknowledged. It wasn't until 1985, 40 years after the war, that the first classified files were quietly declassified by the U.S. Army. The surviving veterans, many in their 60s, began to reconnect and share their experiences publicly for the first time. News outlets ran headlines like "Army of Artists Fooled Hitler" and "The Ghost Army Was Real." Documentaries and museum exhibits soon followed, revealing photographs that looked like almost surreal rows of inflatable tanks under camouflage nets, fake convoys stretching across meadows, and sound trucks blaring the noise of divisions that never existed. For historians, it was a revelation. Here was a unit that had changed the shape of battle not through destruction, but through deception, a force that had demonstrated how imagination could outwit even the most disciplined enemy. By the 2000s, public recognition finally began to take form. Surviving members of the Ghost Army were invited to military ceremonies and historical commemorations. The U.S. Army officially acknowledged their contribution in 2013, calling their operations a critical factor in the Allied victory in Europe. In 2022, after years of lobbying by historians and veterans' families, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. At last, the men who had once built illusions in secret were recognized as warriors of a different kind. Soldiers who had fought not with rifles, but with imagination and courage. For some of them, the recognition came too late. Many had already passed away, their stories told only through faded sketches, wartime diaries, and photographs of decoys half hidden in the mist. Yet their legacy endured not just as a clever wartime trick, but as proof of the boundless ingenuity of the human mind in the face of destruction. The night German tanks vanished beneath a forest of American decoys was no myth. It was the triumph of intellect over fear, of art over violence, of illusion over reality itself. And though decades have passed since those nights along the Rhine, the echoes of that deception still ripple through military doctrine and human memory, a reminder that even in war, victory can sometimes be achieved not by what is real, but by what is believed. As the final files were unsealed, and the names of those forgotten men recorded in history books, the truth finally caught up with the illusion. In the long, unbroken silence that followed World War II, much of the world remembered its heroes by the noise they made, the roar of engines, the crash of artillery, the thunder of victory parades. But the men of the Ghost Army left behind no such sound. Their victories were made of whispers, shadows, and silence, the kind of triumphs that left no ruins, only confusion. The night their decoys glowed beneath the German moonlight, they revealed something extraordinary about modern war. That perception itself had become a battlefield. Where once armies had fought over ground and steel, the Ghost Army fought for belief and won. They turned deception into defense, illusion into strategy, and art into survival. They proved that the power to mislead could save more lives than the power to destroy. Their work stands as a paradox of history, a chapter of warfare defined not by death, but by imagination. In a conflict remembered for its brutality, these soldiers offered a rare glimpse of human creativity rising from chaos painters and sculptors, architects and engineers using the tools of their trades to end a war faster and spare the living. Today, the black and white photographs of their operations seem almost surreal. Inflatable tanks standing in mist, sound trucks hidden under trees, fake divisions marching where no soldiers existed. Yet behind each of those illusions was a profound truth, that even in war's darkest hour, the human mind could still choose creation over destruction. The Ghost Army's legacy endures not only in military history, but in the deeper story of humanity's capacity for ingenuity and mercy. Their decoys did not just deceive an enemy, they redefined what courage could look like, and when the last of them passed into history, they left behind a lesson as timeless as war itself, that sometimes the greatest victories are those fought in silence.